The projector in conference room A was still warm from her presentation when Julian slid the folder across the glass table. Carrie Steffen noticed three things at once. The folder was too thin to be a merger proposal, Julian wasn't meeting her eyes, and the two men flanking the door weren't from legal. She had seen those men before, standing exactly like that, hands clasped, faces blank. The morning Julian's father had fired his own CFO of 19 years. She opened the folder anyway. Restructuring agreement, effective immediately. Signatory, Steffen Cross Technologies. Outgoing party, Dr. Caroline Steffen. The words blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. Outgoing party, her name, her patents, the encryption architecture she had built on 4 hours of sleep and cold takeout for 3 years running. All of it, neatly repackaged into a severance number that looked generous until you understood what it was buying. Her silence, her exit, and every fingerprint she had ever left on the empire they supposedly built together. The board feels, Julian began, in the careful, rehearsed tone of a man who had practiced this in a mirror, that the next phase of growth requires a different structural alignment. The board feels. As though he hadn't been in her bed 2 nights ago, as though she hadn't debugged his pitch deck at midnight so he could walk into that same boardroom and look brilliant. Julian. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, steadier. This is my code. He finally looked at her then, and what she saw wasn't guilt. It was calculation, the same expression he wore when he was closing a deal he'd already decided to take. The company's code, he corrected. Per the original partnership agreement, Section 7. She stopped listening, because she had written Section 7. She had written all of it. The two men by the door took one step forward, an almost polite choreography of removal. Julian straightened his cufflinks. He was already turning toward the other suits waiting in the hallway. New partners, she realized, men she had never met who were already shaking hands over the ruins of her life. Someone will be up to collect your access badge, Julian said. Take whatever's personal from your desk. He didn't look back. The room emptied with practiced efficiency, leaving Carrie standing alone in 43 floors of glass and silence, the folder still open in her hands, the severance figure staring up at her like a number on a ransom note. She set it down. She would not cry here, not in this room that still smelled like her dry erase markers and her ambition, not where the whiteboard still held her handwriting. She picked up her bag, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors opened immediately, and the man inside them made her stop breathing for exactly 3 seconds. He was Korean, somewhere north of 35, dressed in a black suit so precisely cut it seemed less like clothing and more like architecture. Dark hair swept back with the kind of effortless precision that money had long since stopped having to try for. He stood with the stillness of someone who had never once needed to fill a room with noise, because every room he entered already understood, without being told, say that he was the most dangerous thing in it. She had seen him once before. Briefly. Across a crowded gala 2 years ago, where he and Julian's father had exchanged the kind of greetings that are actually warnings. Smiling, measured, laced with the careful voltage of 2 men taking each other's full measure. Hwang Young-Ho. The name Julian had only ever said in a lowered voice, the way people speak about weather systems they cannot control. He was looking at her the way she imagined a chess player looks at a board when they've already seen the next 11 moves. He held the elevator doors open with one hand. In the other, he held a single document, not a folder, not a severance package, not a polite dismantling of everything she had built. A check. He extended it toward her with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once made an offer he expected to be refused. She looked at the number. Then she looked at it again. On triple. Triple the valuation. Triple the figure Julian had just handed her as a goodbye. He sold his soul for a seat at a table, Young-Ho said. His voice was low, precise, and absolutely without performance. I will pay triple for the mind that built it. His dark eyes didn't waver. Will you be my queen, Carrie Steffen? She looked back once, at the empty conference room, the discarded folder, the boardroom full of men celebrating with her work and his name. Then she stepped into the elevator. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below to tell me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far our story is reaching. The projector in conference room A was still warm from her presentation when Julian slid the folder across the glass table. Carrie Steffen noticed three things at once. The folder was too thin to be a merger proposal. Julian wasn't meeting her eyes, and the two men flanking the door weren't from legal. She opened the folder anyway. Restructuring agreement. Effective immediately. Outgoing party. Dr. Caroline Steffen. Her patents. Her encryption architecture. 3 years of 4-hour nights and cold takeout, neatly repackaged into a severance number designed to buy her silence and her exit. The board feels, Julian began in the careful tone of a man who had practiced this in a mirror, that the next phase requires a different structural alignment. She looked up. What she saw in his face wasn't guilt. It was calculation. The same expression he wore when closing a deal he'd already decided to take. She had written the partnership agreement he was now using against her. She had written all of it. The two men by the door stepped forward. Julian straightened his cufflinks and turned toward the new partners, waiting in the hallway, already shaking hands over the ruins of her life. She set the folder down, picked up her bag, walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors opened immediately. The man inside made her stop breathing for exactly 3 seconds. Korean. She's somewhere north of 35. A black suit so precisely cut it seemed less like clothing and more like architecture. Dark hair swept back with the effortless precision of someone who had long since stopped trying to impress rooms, because every room already understood without being told what he was. She had seen him once before, 2 years ago across a crowded gala, where he and Julian's father had exchanged the kind of greetings that are actually warnings. Hwang Young-Ho. The name Julian had only ever spoken in a lowered voice. He held the elevator doors open with one hand, in the other a single document. Not a folder, not a severance package. A check. He extended it with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never made an offer he expected, refused. She looked at the number, then looked again. Triple the valuation. Triple everything Julian had just handed her as a goodbye. He sold his soul for a seat at a table, Young-Ho said. Low, precise, without performance. I will pay triple for the mind that built it. His dark eyes didn't waver. Will you be my queen, Carrie Steffen? She looked back once, at the empty conference room, the discarded folder, the boardroom full of men celebrating with her work and his name. Then she stepped into the elevator. The contract arrived the following morning. 12 pages, single-spaced, all delivered by a man in a black car who waited at the curb with the patience of someone paid to wait for exactly as long as necessary. Carrie read every word. She was, above all else, a woman who read the fine print, which was precisely how she knew what Julian had done to her before he finished his sentence. The Hwang agreement was different, precise where Julian's had been vague, ironclad where his had left convenient gaps. Young-Ho wasn't offering her a role. He was offering her a kingdom, with every stone of its foundation documented and witnessed and signed in triplicate. She initialed the last page at her kitchen table, still in yesterday's clothes, her cold coffee untouched beside her hand. The same black car was waiting when she looked up. She packed one bag. She had spent 3 years building something for a man who saw her as inventory. She was not sentimental about the furniture. The estate sat behind 12-foot walls of pale stone on the northern edge of the city, the kind of property that didn't appear on public listings because it had never needed to be sold. A private drive. A gate that recognized the car before it stopped. Motion sensors disguised as garden lighting, cameras embedded in the stonework at angles that covered every blind spot. Carrie catalogued it all on the ride from the gate to the front door, because that was how her mind worked. She saw architecture the way other people saw faces, and this house had the face of something that had never once been caught off guard. Her room was on the 3rd floor. Ivory walls, a desk already stocked with the exact model of secondary monitor she had listed in her professional profile, a view of a garden that was too perfectly maintained to be decorative. A young woman named Ji-yeon showed her the house with the brisk efficiency of someone who managed far more complex things than guest orientations. When Carrie asked about the panel beside the bedroom door, Ji-yeon paused for only a half-second before explaining. Biometric entry, temperature and environmental controls, private secure line. And the cameras in the hallway, Carrie said. How many? Ji-yeon smiled for the first time. Mr. Hwang said you would ask that. How many? Enough, Ji-yeon said, and moved on to the kitchen. That evening, Young-Ho appeared in the doorway of the study where Carrie had set up her laptop. You counted the cameras, he said. You counted the cameras, he said. 14 visible, she replied. I assume there are more. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite approval. Something more careful than that. You'll be safe here. I didn't ask about safety, she said. I asked about cameras. He looked at her for a moment with that same unreadable steadiness. Then he left. She went back to her screen, but she was smiling very slightly at her own reflection in the dark window. She found the file 3 weeks later. It was buried in a legacy folder on the shared legal server Young-Ho had granted her access to. Old documents from a corporate restructuring that predated the Hwang Group's current form by nearly 2 decades. She had been searching for acquisition records. She found, instead, a name, Hwang Dae-jung, Investment Portfolio 2003, Seed Capital Cross-Border Tech Fund, Partner, Cross Capital Holdings, Julian's father's first company. She sat very still. She pulled every thread she could find. Annual reports, liquidation filings, a civil suit that had been settled quietly and sealed. The picture that assembled itself was slow and methodical and devastating. A young Korean investor who had backed the right technology at the right moment, whose American partner had rerouted the returns, reclassified the assets, and walked away with everything while the original investor was left holding a restructured shell with no liquidity and no recourse. Hwang Dae-jung had died 4 years after the settlement. The cause of death listed in the obituary she found was cardiac failure. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she walked down 2 flights of stairs to Young-Ho's office and set the printed documents on his desk without a word. He looked at them. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had simply grown accustomed to the weight. You knew, she said. Yes. You chose me because Julian betrayed me, the same way your father was betrayed. He met her eyes. I chose you because you are the only person alive who understands exactly what was stolen and exactly how to take it back. A pause. The rest was alignment. She picked up the papers and walked back upstairs. She did not sleep that night. But by morning, she understood the shape of the board they were both playing on. And for the first time since Julian had slid that folder across the table, she felt something clarify inside her chest, like code finally compiling clean. The Meridian Gala was the social event of the quarter, the kind of evening where fortunes were gestured at across champagne flutes and alliances were formed in the language of who stood next to whom. Julian would be there. His new partners, too, the ones she now knew had been circling her technology for 2 years before they found a door Julian was willing to open. Young-Ho told her nothing about what to wear and gave no instructions about how to behave. He simply said, "The car leaves at 8, and handed her a card for an account she had not known existed. She bought one dress. Ivory, not white, not cream, but the precise luminous tone of someone who understood the difference. The neckline was architectural. The silhouette was a statement. When she came down the stairs at 5 minutes to 8, Ji-yeon stopped mid-sentence in whatever she'd been saying to the driver. Young-Ho turned from the window. He looked at her for exactly long enough to communicate that he had catalogued every detail, then said, "We're late," and walked to the car. She had been to this ballroom before, on Julian's arm, smiling at men who looked through her to him. Tonight, the room rearranged itself differently. People turned. Conversations paused. Young-Ho moved through the space like a current, and she moved beside him not as an accessory, but as an equal axis, the two of them generating their own gravity. She saw Julian 20 minutes in. He was across the room with his new board, laughing at something, already looser than he should have been, already performing success for an audience that was only half watching. Then he looked up and saw her. The laugh stopped. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let him understand that she was not diminished, not hiding, not gone. And then she turned back to the conversation Young-Ho had drawn her into, where 3 industry directors were listening to her with the focused, hungry attention of people who had just realized they were in the presence of someone who actually understood the technology they'd only been reading about. She didn't look at Julian again. She didn't need to. But 2 days later, the rumor reached them. A financial journalist had received an anonymous tip. Dark money, offshore accounts, Young-Ho's transition into legitimate business, framed as a laundering operation. The story was thin, the sourcing was untraceable, and the timing, coming the morning after the gala, was not a coincidence. Julian, it turned out, was not finished. He was simply no longer playing the game. The car came out of nowhere on a Tuesday. Carrie had broken protocol, Young-Ho's word, not hers, by slipping out of the estate alone to visit the server lab she still rented under a name Julian had never known about. She was 3 blocks from the entrance when the black sedan accelerated out of a side street with the deliberate geometry of something that wasn't an accident. She didn't have time to run. She didn't need to. The 2 men who materialized from the building entrance beside her moved with the quiet, total efficiency of people who had rehearsed this exact scenario many times. The sedan stopped. A brief conversation happened through the driver's window, conducted entirely in the language of proximity and posture. The sedan left. Young-Ho was waiting at the estate when she returned. He didn't ask where she had been. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Julian's new partners are not patient men. They know you exist, which means they know what you know." "What do I know?" she asked. "That," he said, "is what concerns them." She went to the server lab the next morning, with an escort this time, and it was there, sorting through the cold backup drives she had carried out of Steffen Cross, in a tote bag the morning Julian handed her that folder, that she found it. She almost missed it. It was nested 4 directories deep inside an archived build she had labeled 3 years ago with nothing more than a date and the initials CS. She had written it as a failsafe, a private key embedded in the original encryption architecture, one that could authenticate, override, or systematically unravel every system built on her core code. She had included it the way a sculptor hides a signature inside the stone, not for anyone else, simply because she had built it and it was hers, or Julian had taken the code. He had sold the code. He had signed the code over to men in expensive offices who were now licensing it to governments and financial institutions across 4 continents. But he had never known about the key, because she had never told him, because there had been a version of her 3 years ago that had understood quietly, without ever letting herself fully think it. That trust had an architecture too. Oh, and that smart architects always kept one load-bearing element to themselves. She sat in the blue light of the server lab for a long time. Then she called Young-Ho. He arrived within 20 minutes, which told her he had not been far. He looked at the screen without touching anything, which told her he understood what he was looking at. Then he looked at her with something she had not seen from him before. Not admiration exactly, but something closer to recognition. "You knew," he said. "Not consciously, but some part of you knew." "Some part of me always knew," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a chair from across the room, sat down across from her, and said the thing she had sensed gathering behind his composure for weeks. His father had been an engineer, not so different from her in the ways that mattered. A man who built things, who believed that the integrity of what he created would protect him from the people who wanted to take it. He had been the original capital behind a small Seoul-based technology firm in the early 2000s, a firm whose American licensing partner had systematically dismantled and absorbed his stake through forged agreements and a very deliberate legal siege. That licensing partner had been the Cross family, Julian's grandfather, the foundation on which Steffen Cross Technologies had been quietly, profitably built. His father had died before Young-Ho was old enough to litigate. He had grown up with the documentation, the evidence, and a patience so deep it had become structural. "I didn't choose you because you were available," Young-Ho said. "I chose the moment. Julian's betrayal created a door, and I walked through it. But you—" He stopped, considered. "You were never part of the calculation. You became something outside it." She understood. It was the same thing she had refused to say about him for weeks now, that somewhere between the fortress of glass and the server lab and the quiet evenings where they talked about architecture and legacy and the strange mathematics of revenge, he had stopped being a transaction. She didn't say it. Neither did he. But the room held it, the way rooms hold things that don't need to be spoken to be real. The summit was in Geneva, 4 days away. Julian was scheduled to present the licensing expansion to a global board of sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors, the single largest legitimization of everything he had stolen. Once those signatures landed, the code would be so thoroughly laundered through international capital that unwinding it legally would take a decade. Young-Ho's intelligence confirmed what they had both suspected. Julian knew they were coming. He had arranged for a pre-summit briefing that would quietly discredit the Hwang Steffen group as a hostile actor, framing Young-Ho's involvement as a criminal acquisition attempt. He intended to have Carrie removed from the venue before she could speak. He had people inside the conference security apparatus, and he had spent considerable money ensuring the first hour of the summit would go exactly as he designed it. They spent 3 days preparing. Carrie worked in 12-hour stretches, building the presentation that was not a presentation, a live demonstration, executable from a single authenticated command that would expose the failsafe she had embedded in the original code. Every system Julian was about to sell to those funds would, in that moment, visibly and verifiably defer to her master key. Not theoretically, in real time. On a screen large enough for every person in that room to watch it happen. Young-Ho worked in parallel, in the language he was fluent in. By the time they boarded the flight to Geneva, every board member who mattered had received a quiet, thorough, and impeccably sourced briefing on the Cross family's original acquisition of the Hwang capital stake. Not an accusation, a history, documented, dated, and delivered with the kind of calm that is more devastating than anger. They arrived at the summit not through the side entrance Julian's people had assumed they would use. They walked through the main doors of the Palais des Nations, with the coordinated unhurry of people who had already won, and were now simply showing up for the formality of it. Julian saw her from across the hall. She watched his expression move through several stages in under 2 seconds, surprise, recalculation, and then the specific contraction of a man who has realized, too late, that he misunderstood the board entirely. He was 40 minutes into his presentation when Carrie stood. She didn't interrupt. She waited for the precise moment he referenced the encryption architecture, her words, her framework, her 3 years, and then she requested the floor with the calm of someone who had earned it several times over. The moderator, briefed in advance by 2 of the board members Young-Ho had spoken to, recognized her without hesitation. She opened her laptop. She typed a single authenticated command. Every screen in the room populated with the same thing. The core code, the embedded key, and a live verification signature that could only belong to its original author. Her name, her credential hash, her architecture signed in a language that left no interpretive room whatsoever. The room went very still. Julian started to speak. One of Young-Ho's men, positioned near the AV panel with the unremarkable presence of conference staff, simply ensured that the microphone in front of Julian remained technically unavailable. Carrie spoke for 11 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She presented the history of the code, the documentation of its creation, the evidence of its unauthorized transfer, and the legal framework that her attorneys, retained and prepared over the past 3 weeks, had already filed in 3 jurisdictions. When she finished, the room did not applaud. It did something quieter and more permanent. It shifted. The kind of shift that happens when the people with the real money understand, simultaneously, that they have been nearly defrauded, and that the woman standing in front of them is the actual asset. Julian left the hall through a side door. No one followed him. No one needed to. Young-Ho was standing near the back of the room, as he always was. Not at the center, not performing, just present in the way that load-bearing structures are present. Invisible until you understand that everything standing upright is standing because of them. He caught her eye across the hall. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the board members, now moving toward her, and she began the work of building what came next. Outside the tall windows of the Palais, Geneva glittered against a winter sky, indifferent and permanent. Inside, a woman who had spent 3 years making someone else brilliant stood at the front of the room and let them see, finally, exactly what she was. A queen doesn't wait to be crowned. She simply stops allowing anyone to pretend she isn't.